Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Crown and today we are going to have some more stories that I hope that you will enjoy. But before we start, it would be so much appreciated if you would subscribe to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it, and maybe leave a comment down below. These simple clicks would mean a lot to the future of this channel and really reward the effort that I put in every day. And now, without further ado, let's go! First story. Should have just paid the rent. So this is a story about my parents around 7 or 8 years ago when I was barely leaving elementary school. I was really young and my parents kept my sister and I in the dark at the time, but they later told me the gist of what happened. First things first, my parents owned 2 houses. They decided to keep the old house when they bought a new one so they could rent it out. The old house was in a decent area but on the edge of the not-so-good part of the city, so it attracted a lot of the wrong crowd when my parents put it up for rent. After the horror story of the first tenant used a dumb loophole in our state in order to live there for almost 6 months rent-free, my parents found a single woman with temporary foster kids who was interested. Let's call her Bad Tenant. She seemed really nice at first, housing kids who needed a home and selling homemade tacos from her taco cart. My parents did a background check and saw that her income from the state for the kids should cover the rent and figure her side hustle would help her out. Everything is signed and she moves in with her kids immediately. And now the wrongdoing. The bad tenant had decided to take in a lot more kids, given that our house was larger than her previous one. I have nothing against these kids and they are just victims, but they tore that house to shreds. I remember countless times of going with my dad to the house and handing him tools while he fixed a variety of broken things, especially the toilets and general plumbing. Eventually, my dad had enough and told her that all the maintenance he was doing was not required since the house was in perfect condition when she moved in. I was not due to anything on my parents' part. We planned on moving back after my sis finished high school, so we replaced anything we thought would break and repainted it. Caused by the way too many kids in the house, this pissed off the bad tenant and she stopped paying her rent. Just some backstory. My dad is a fairly reasonable guy and I have never seen him give attitude to anyone, let alone yell. My mother, however, is your typical Hispanic mother who doesn't take nonsense from anyone. That being said, when my mom took me with her to pick up the rent where the bad tenant said some nasty things to my mom, she kinda lost it. The screaming match was awful, but there was no physical contact on either end and it ended with the bad tenant basically stating she wasn't going to pay a cent until my dad came back and continued doing all the maintenance he was doing prior. The bad tenant was dead serious about this, and my parents had to take her to court. I later learned she only did this in order to stay at the house a little longer without having to pay rent. My parents were pissed. This was the second time a tenant had gotten away without paying rent. At this point, I need to say I truly love my dad, but my mom is the most dedicated person I know. If she wants something, she will find some way to get it. She was born and raised in Central America, traveled all the way to the US, went to school, learned English on her own, supported her brothers and worked all the time. That being said, my mom was not going to let this woman take advantage of us. The first thing she did was head to child services with photos of the house condition, courtesy of my father who always took photos of the house when he went over for the maintenance. They looked over and thanked her profusely for the evidence and told them they would look into it. Next, my parents got a lawyer who collected all the photos we took before she moved in to prove the house condition before she moved in. Now, I wasn't in the courtroom, but from what my dad told me, it was the most satisfying thing he's ever seen. The bad tenant's lawyer was a huge joke. I was obviously the cheapest and most inexperienced lawyer around. The bad tenant and her lawyer basically tried lying for every point they made, where my dad and his lawyer simply pulled out a photo or message, completely destroying their argument. Eventually, the bad tenant was contradicting herself and the judge ruled in my parents' favor. Now my parents knew that they were not going to see a dime from the lady, given that she no longer could house kids. Oops. It also turns out she was using her mother's name in order to house even more kids, which explains why they were given to her to begin with. So she was going to answer to that too. Double whoops. Lastly, just to put the cherry on the cake, my parents put a lien on her taco cart, so she couldn't make money that way either. Triple whoops. This might not be enough for this sub, but you need to understand my parents are hard-working people who made something of themselves when given nothing. Piece of crap people shouldn't take advantage of hard-working people. That's it. Next story. Contractor procrastinates for profit, gets prison. This is something that happened to my grandfather. To understand him, he was a quality control engineer for a pretty major manufacturing firm, and he was a master of aggressively renegotiating deals. He was and is a strict taskmaster, not entitled or unreasonable, but if something went wrong there would be hell to pay. So he decided that he wanted to renovate his house. Take the moderately big 2-story house and add 2 new bedrooms and a master bath. He brings in a contractor and gets a quote. Says as part of the work they will need to completely refinish the front too. Grandfather agrees and they start work. It is a serious effort. Winds up carving open the whole front of the house and all sorts of madness. Things go well enough at first. The destruction goes smoothly. Then start construction. At first things were just slow going. Sluggish delivery from sources, slow permits from the city, you get the idea. Then things get silly. It took them over 3 months to start and finish the plumbing. 4 months for the insulation. My grandfather is paying for a lot of time and not a lot of work done. He's irritated about the speed, but besides making some noise there is not really much to be done about it. Bit by bit the house starts to come together. Then as they are putting on the weatherproofing, an inspector comes in and puts a stop to the whole affair. The contractor had improperly filed the plans. Now my grandfather is pretty furious by this point. But he keeps a cool enough head. Starts asking what's going to be done about it with the contractor. The thinking was that they redraft the plans and send them out for reapproval. The contractor says he will do it. 5 months go by and the house is just sitting there. A fancy new framework still hanging in the breeze. Then all of a sudden the contractor says he's pulling out. And he had no idea the hell he'd unleashed. My grandfather did not just jump straight to suing him. Oh no sir. He took his time before even getting a lawyer. He did his homework. He tracked down every single client that this guy had for the last 3 years and did a deep dive on the books to figure out what the hell happened. Turns out that this wasn't an isolated incident, just the most egregious. As it happens, this contractor had a penchant for screwing people over, turning minor renovation jobs into complete dumpster fires. His modus operandi was to file the changes with the city, make a private second set of plans, start making things based on the second set, intentionally let the city halt the construction, then restart the project on a third draft. After talking to some of the other customers, he and 8 of the other victims collectively filed charges against him. They annihilated this guy. They took every cent he had, which wasn't that much. His scheme hadn't actually done him that much good. Liquidated his company, sent him to something like 15 years in prison for fraud, and got the state to help recoup expenses. 2 months later, a new contracting company blitzed my grandfather's renovations, and he was able to drink in his master's suite to toast his revenge. Next story. HOA and the city contract, aka how the HOA got fined. So some quick backstory to this. I don't live with an HOA thankfully, but I have had dealings with them. I studied environmental engineering in college and have a degree with a specialization in water treatment systems. Normally though, that's not my day job. Even so, recently, a friend of mine who works with one of the neighboring cities asked me if I wouldn't mind doing some tests for water pollution in a waterfowl preservation area. There have been some strange die-off events going on, and the city was trying to figure out where the source of pollution was coming from. Upon operating under a special contract from the city, I was given access to any location along this waterfowl area, within reason, to perform my test. I will not go into detail about how the tests work. They are involved and can be painful. But suffice it to say that I started taking water and soil samples from likely sources along the waterfowl preserve borders. This showed me that there was a notable amount of nitrates and phosphates in the water, which I surmised was affecting the birds. Now to find the source. I followed the river up its length, passing a number of housing sites, a couple of apartments and the odd settling bond. Over the course of several weeks and a barrage of tests, these were ruled out as sources. The further I went up the river though, the stronger the concentrations became, to the point that it was dangerous for humans to even be in contact with the water. We're talking super fun type pollution. This was last summer. As I waded up along this area, I heard some splashing and the sounds of kids playing in the water. Not good at all. Turning the bend, I come face to face with a small dock leading into the water, and 4 or 5 kids taking turns jumping off it into the water. The heavily polluted, dangerous water. There is some lady sitting on the dock watching them, and I approached her. I forget the exchange, but it boiled down to me telling her that I'm from the city, and based on some of what had been found, the children were banned from swimming in the river. The lady tried arguing the point until I told her that I was calling the marshal, code enforcement, to have this area barricaded off, and if she wants, she could explain her complaints to him. She grabbed the kids and scuttled off. Marshall did arrive, found that the dock wasn't built with proper code standards, and he condemned it, forcing the HOA who had built it to have it demolished within the week, or the city was going to do it and they would front the bill. That still left the matter of the pollution. That's where things got weird. Once I passed this HOA subdivision, all pollution vanished. I must have done 5 or 6 further tests to verify this, but yeah, no pollution. So I had my culprit. The next question was figuring out what they were doing. And that's where my investigative side comes in. With the help of the marshal, I started going around the properties of the HOA, talking with residents. It was a few simple questions like, do you know if they are fertilizing the grass? When do they do this? And do you know the type of fertilizer they use? Just gathering evidence. Remember the lady from earlier? Turned out she was the HOA president. I only found this after she called the police on the marshal and I, reporting strange men wandering around her neighborhood. She called him something like 4 times in a day before the police flat out told her, they work with the city, and if you keep calling, we are charging you. That didn't stop her from following us around in her car and taking photos with her phone. Eventually, we spoke with one older gentleman that broke the case as it were. The HOA president had been fining people for not having perfectly green grass. We were in a drought at the time, so that's no surprise there. After several of the people in the subdivision got fined by the city for watering their grass, she had taken matters into her own hands. She'd first tried contracting a landscaper to spray the lawns with fertilizer, but due to various EPA regulations, he apparently refused. The homeowner couldn't be certain what the lady had done next, but a couple days after that, Some guys turned up with a large farm-type trailer of liquid. They sprayed every single foot of grass the HOA controlled, even right down to the water's edge. With the homeowner's permission, I took several soil samples from around his property, and then samples from the common area that joined the grassy area beside the river and the dock. It took about a week to get full results back, but I had my answer. This lady had some contractors or someone spraying farm-grade fertilizer on the grass. This particular fertilizer is heavily controlled by the EPA and requires a special license to even possess, much less use. I presented all my evidence to my contact at the city and laid out just how serious the damage was, and that I was legally obligated to report the HOA to the State Regulatory Board for gross violations. My contract took the papers and paid me for my services, thanking me, but also noting that if she went to court, I would need to testify about my findings. Epilogue. The court was originally scheduled for March of 2020, but it never came to that. The HOA president entered a plea deal with the state, where she and the HOA were required to pay for the environmental cleanup of the river, as well as restitution to the state. The fines alone topped close to $250,000, and the cleanup, still ongoing, is expected to break $1 million itself. The HOA president got the boot, while the HOA itself was, last I heard, facing being dissolved by the state due to multiple cases of negligence and inept management. I don't know how they came in contact with that fertilizer, though I suspect some of the charges against the HOA president had something to do with that. Next story. Costing a company millions. So I worked as a quality assurance at a factory I will call Idaho. To get started, I will explain the report process. When something goes wrong in a factory that is directly tied to quality, such as bad coloring or defects, I as a QA lead would have to write a report. These reports were very detailed and extremely time-consuming. Now when something went wrong that wasn't directly tied to quality but affected it, such as a machine break-in or a foreign material getting in the machines, the lead in charge of the machines was supposed to write that report. Somehow all the reports ended up being written by me, even though I had my own time-consuming job to do. I have been fighting to not do others' reports for months, and my boss told me to remind other leads when a report was needed. One day I'm doing my reports plus my data analysis duties, and I hear over the radio that a refrigerator unit has gone out, and all the products was coming out as boiled mush instead of frozen. So I call refrigeration and tell them you need to do a report on this. I will send out an email counting how many pallets of product we lost. So I send the email and continue on with my day. 2 weeks later, my boss calls me into her office and asks me why I didn't write a report on the incident. I say, "You told me to remind the other leads to do it, and not write their reports." She responded, "Well, if you have time to send an email, you have time to write a report." Then she makes a sign or write-up for failure to do my duties, which I did placidly cause she had written up everyone else in my department and had been looking for something to write me up for. So I decided to let her have it and get out of the way. Well, a couple months later and the exact same happens again, and all I do is tell refrigeration over the radio to write a report. I did nothing else knowing that refrigeration wouldn't write it. Because there was no report or helpful emails, the product was almost shipped out 2 months later, but it was caught by one of my QAs who mentioned the incident to my boss. Boss calls me to her office and tells me, "This incident is going to cost the company millions in storage fees. For the time it was already stored, disposal fees, lost products, and a fine from Walmart for not meeting the contract. Why didn't you email me about this?" I tell her I didn't have the time, but I did tell refrigeration to write a report. She couldn't write me up for it cause I had emails from her telling me how to handle these situations. And she couldn't write me up for it, because I had emails from her telling me how to handle these situations. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.